Here we have a picture of the oak tree, St Oliver oak tree at Ardpatrick, County Louth, just outside Louth village. And this is the oak tree in which St Oliver hid from his pursuers at Ardpatrick in the 1670s. Glorious martyr St Oliver, who willingly gave your life for your faith, help us also to be strong in faith. May we be loyal like you to the See of Peter. By your intercession and example, may all hatred and bitterness be banished from the hearts of Irish men and women. May the peace of Christ reign in our hearts, as it did in your heart, even at the moment of your death. Pray for us and for Ireland. Amen. I've lived here all my life. I was baptised here. I received my first communion here, my confirmation. So I took Oliver as a confirmation name. And I didn't realise at the time the significance of that. I suppose as time went on, I wrote a few little pamphlets on St Oliver, and I've written a book. St Oliver, of course, was born in 1625 in Oldcastle, inland from Drogheda in County Meath. In the year 1625, the family owned about 700-800 acres of land, 250 hectares of land. They had their own corn mill, they had their own little church, tower house, etc., and they were pretty well off. His father was John Plunkett, the Baron of Loughcrew, and his mother, Thomasina Dillon. Her grandfather was Sir Lucas Dillon. Of the Dillons, the Earls of Roscommon. They were of Norman extraction, and indeed the very first account was the death of a John Plunkett at Bewley, just outside Drogheda here, in the year 1082. Well, as a youth, he wished to become a priest. He was tutored by a first cousin of his mother, Father Patrick Plunkett, who later became Bishop of Ardagh and Bishop of Meath. He went to Rome in 1647 and he entered the Irish College in Rome. Well, during the 1640s, of course, Ireland was a troublesome place. We had the Ulster Rising. Cromwell came to Ireland in 1649. And the first town he sacked, if you like, was here in Drogheda. Put quite a few people to the sword. Not as many as people say he did, but nevertheless he was quite ruthless. Oliver then was an exemplary student in Rome. He had undertaken and promised to return to Ireland after his ordination. That became impossible because of the situation here in Ireland. It would be literally a suicide mission to return to Ireland as a young priest when he was ordained in 1654. The Cromwellian conquest had overrun Ireland. Very difficult for any young priest to survive any length of time. So he stayed on in Rome. He undertook higher studies, an exemplary student, a doctorate in canon and civil law. He became a professor in Propaganda Fide College in Rome. Ireland, of course, was one of the four kingdoms. English people got enough of the Cromwellians. The Puritans were extreme and going way too far. King Charles II ascended the throne in 1660, but that didn't bring any great respite to the Catholics. King Charles was walking a tightrope. The conflicts over religion were not really conflicts over religion per se. They were conflicts over land and property and money and power. Nothing really changes over the centuries. It took a few years for things to settle down in Ireland. The Roman authorities felt it opportune to appoint a couple of bishops to Ireland, perhaps one in each province. So Oliver was appointed as Archbishop of Armagh in 1669, and he returned. The Catholic Church in Ireland hadn't had proper leadership for over 30 years. During the 1640s, Ulster Rising. Then there was the 1650s, Cromwellian conquest, the Restoration, and King Charles II ascended the throne the third consecutive decade. There was no church structure, there was no leadership in the church in Ireland. So for 30 years, the Catholic Church in Ireland didn't have any proper leadership. And Oliver set to work straight away. Drink was one of the problems with amongst the priests. He forbade all-night wakes, he forbade drinking at wakes, he forbade priests from frequenting taverns. He gave the church stability, which it needed more than anything. And he re-established the lines of communication between the Church in Ireland and Rome. There are over 230 of his letters still in existence. 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 words, some of them long, and they give a marvellous account of the church history of Ireland at the time. He founded a school here in Drogheda. He set up one of the first, if not the first, integrated schools in Ireland, which he founded here in Drogheda. It accommodated 150 pupils, 40 of whom were Protestant. Oliver was brought before the tribunal in Dublin within a 2-year period, defending the schools on 9 occasions. In 1673, King Charles' brother, James, had become a Catholic. King Charles didn't have any legitimate children, and I stress legitimate. So if anything were happened to Charles, King James then would ascend the throne, which he did later on. Protestants were very much afraid of that. They were afraid of anything that might put their ill-gotten gains at risk. The Test Act was brought in England. No Catholic could hold any position whatsoever unless they attended a Protestant church, and James found himself going into exile for a couple of years at that time. The laws at the time, over the centuries, were strictly anti-Catholic, and it depended on how they were interpreted. So in 1673, these laws, which were already on the statute books, were interpreted more strictly. And Oliver's new school in Drogheda, which he had built up from the ground, was knocked to the ground by the authorities in late 1673. But he carried it on nevertheless, and he travelled in disguise, travelling from county to county, from parish to parish, administering the sacrament of confirmation, and he wrote about travelling as a Captain William Brown, with my sword, my wig, and my pair of pistols. On many occasions he would meet soldiers, etc., and he would be able to pass himself off an officer on a special mission, so to speak. Being from Anglo-Irish stock, there was always that tension, great tension actually, between the Gaelic Irish, particularly of the northern end of the diocese and the northern end of the country, and the Anglo-Irish down the south. Anglo-Irish who had come into the country hundreds of years before, assimilated part of the Irish customs, religion, but nevertheless they were much more loyal to the crown, as Oliver and his family and the Plunketts would have been. He brought peace to the province. He's now regarded, of course, as a patron for peace and reconciliation, because one of the first things he did was he went to the Rapparees or Tories, dispossessed Catholics of a generation or so before. Some of them were going back to the Ulster plantation, living roughly in the hills and the mountains and the forest, etc. And they would attack some of the Protestant settlers, set hayracks on fire, steal cattle or sheep or stock. The local militia then would, unable to find them, fine local Catholic families, innocent Catholic families, and accuse them of supporting the Tories or the Rapparees. So Oliver went to these people. First of all, he had negotiated a ceasefire with the Viceroy and the President of Ulster. That peace agreement meant that these were wanted men who would have been hung. It has certain similarities with the Good Friday Agreement in that they laid down their arms, they decommissioned their arms, and prisoners were released. There were 3 prisoners in particular who were sentenced to death in Enniskillen prison, and they were released. And about 15 of the leaders went into exile, and Oliver went more than halfway. He met them in Dublin, and he escorted them on board ship. And that brought peace to the province, and he could write afterwards that the province has not seen such peace in over 30 years. So after the Test Act was enacted in 1673, and for the remainder of his apostolate until 1679, until his capture, he was in hiding, living in attics and going from one area to another in secret. Puritans and the Commons in England were gaining in strength against King Charles. There was all the time that tussle between King Charles and the Puritans. Oliver found himself persecuted more and more. Catholics in England likewise. A disreputable character by the name of Titus Oates came on the scene. Now, he saw an opportunity to get some money, to live a comfortable lifestyle, by accusing prominent Catholics of conspiracy against the crown in particular. He accused prominent Catholics of conspiring to kill the king, because after all, if King Charles II was killed, he would be succeeded by James, a Catholic. Oliver was drawn into that in Ireland. Titus Oates and Lord Shaftesbury, they accused him of conspiring to bring a French army into Ireland, which would be an entry into England through the back door. The English paranoia at the time, and a lot of it was fake news, and we know all about fake news in today's world, and that was very important at the time because there's no way of verifying the truth of these stories. The common people believed these stories, that Catholics were plotting against the Protestants, going to kill them in their beds, bring a French army in through the back door and overrun the country. Many Catholic priests arrested, a dozen or more put to death, horrific death at Tyburn, hung, drawn and quartered during the years 1679 to 1681. Oliver was arrested in Dublin. He had gone to visit a cousin of his, Father Patrick, then Bishop of Meath, Bishop Patrick, and he had been ill. So he was brought to trial in Dundalk, but the trial quickly fell through because some of those who were to give evidence against him were disreputable characters themselves, and they were wanted men themselves. A couple in particular, retrograde priests who Oliver had censored, and they accused him of reconnoitring Carlingford Harbour to bring in the French army. He was brought to Newgate Prison in London, very strict solitary confinement. He fasted 3 or 4 days a week on bread and water. This account was given by some of his jailers, who became very impressed with him. He was brought over to London in November of that year. He had spent the previous winter in prison in Dublin Castle, and the following winter he spent in Newgate Prison in London. Unheated prison cells, very harsh winters. The mid-16th century is termed the Little Ice Age, and temperatures were several degrees cooler and colder than they are now, and frost was much more frequent. He was brought before trial then in Westminster Hall, the Great Westminster Hall, before the Lord Chief Justice, Pemberton, in May of 1681. The jurors, several of them, and he objected to 2 of them in particular, had served as jurors on trials of other priests who were convicted and condemned to death. The witnesses came forward, but let us not forget that the witnesses were all Irish. They were all bought and brought over from Ireland to England. 4 or 5 lay people who had been promised pardon from prison and pardon of their crimes, and 3 or 4 priests who also were promised pardon for their crimes. One of whom accused of giving powder and shot to the Tories. He didn't stand much chance there in London. He didn't have any witnesses himself. He asked for time to bring over witnesses from Ireland. There were 7 or 8 witnesses on the way, and they arrived in London a few days after the trial. He was refused that time, a great injustice to him. The jury retired to consider the verdict and returned a verdict after only 15 minutes deliberations. The verdict, of course, was guilty of high treason, which was a capital offence. The Lord Chief Justice Pemberton announced the sentence that he would be hung, drawn and quartered, and taken from there to the place of execution, Tyburn. He was brought back to his prison cell. He had about 16 days left in prison. During that time he had a little more freedom. He had visitors because as a condemned man he was allowed some visitors, and this was a great blessing to some of the Catholics in London who were able to visit him and receive a blessing from him. On the morning of execution, around 9 o'clock in the morning, he was brought about 2 miles from Newgate Prison, dragged on a hurdle, stretched, lying face upward. It was a festival occasion. There were thousands of people there. This would have been the first bishop to have been martyred, if you like, and killed at Tyburn for over 100 years. There was a stand set up at Tyburn Gallows, and Tyburn Gallows was a 3-legged gallows, and it could hang up to 20 people at a time. It was quite a business for the time. He was hung, drawn and quartered on the 1st of July 1681. Terrible death. Oliver had no fear at all of it. He surprised himself, and he wrote about that he had no fear at all, and he looked forward to meeting the Lord. And he wrote about meeting the true judge, where there would be no false witnesses against him. His head was thrown in the fire and was quickly retrieved by his servant, James McKenna. The head, which came back to Drogheda some 40 years later, is here in St. Peter's Church, and many people would come and venerate the head every day. The scorch marks can still be seen on the left cheek and on the lip. The rest of his body was taken away and was buried in St. Giles of the Fields in London, and it was brought via Lamspring in Germany by a priest, Don Morris Corker, whom he met in Newgate Prison and had befriended. They had heard each other's confessions in prison. The body then came back to Downside Abbey in Somerset, and in fact most of his body is in Downside Abbey. His tomb is in Downside Abbey in Somerset and is still there. And he's regarded as patron for peace and reconciliation. There have been many coincidences with St. Oliver. He did bring peace to the province in the 1670s. He was also instrumental, or he had a part to play in the peace which was made after the War of Independence in Ireland in 1920. Because the very first year after that, the first feast day after his beatification in 1920 was the day the truce came into being between the Irish forces and the forces of the Crown in Ireland, including the Black and Tans. More recently, in 1998 and the Good Friday Agreement, certain similarities with the St. Oliver's Peace Agreement of 1670 with the Rapparees and the government of the day in Ireland. The major part of it was the release of prisoners and the decommissioning of arms. The very first time that the northern parties sat in the same room, decommissioning hadn't yet taken place, was on the Feast of St. Oliver in 1998. It's a coincidence, but maybe there are no such thing as coincidences like that. We have a lovely procession here in Drogheda, which is very well attended every year on the first Sunday of July at 3 o'clock.